We're good.
Awesome.
All right. Hello one, hello all, hello others, big and small. Welcome to the other side of history where we look at things and how we look at them. My name's Duncan.
My name's Ian.
And now let's ask some questions. Let's start. Who are you? That's my first question.
I'm the other person. Nah.
Awesome.
So my name's Ian. I am a sophomore mechanical engineering major here at Umass, and I've always just had an interest in history, just always something I've loved to study and look at. I wanted to be a history teacher when I was very young, but that kind of faded as I grew older. The interest never did, though.
Any specific area of history you like, or?
I really like older history, like Greco-Roman type stuff.
Okay.
Maybe like colonial times are very interesting, but
All right.
that's sort of what I like to talk about.
You know, I'm glad you said that because it sounds like you're in the right place. So
Really?
I'll answer some questions now. So what are we doing here? For today's purpose, we're going to observe historical and cultural groups through the lens of otherness, with a focus on two specific areas. But first, we should understand what I mean by otherness. Essentially, it's a concept that aims to define the relationship between groups of people through the point of view of a single dominant group. This can be applied to anybody in a huge variety of ways. It just depends on the point of view. To get a little more technical, we can turn to Jean-Francois Stassac's definition of otherness from the International Encyclopedia of Human Geography. That's already a mouthful. To quote, "Otherness is the result of a discursive process by which a dominant in-group constructs one or many dominated out-groups by stigmatizing a difference, real or imagined, presented as a negation of identity and thus a motive for potential discrimination." That was not more of a mouthful, just to say the same thing I just said.
Yeah, actually, though.
It gets a little confusing, but I'll make it simple. Otherness and the other are a product of a perceived relationship. There may be literally nothing separating these two groups of people except power, and that's why it's so interesting to see how it's applied to media. You can see it in all sorts of literature, and now American pop culture has embraced it as a driving concept in the film industry. Here I'll turn to Robin Wood. Wood was a key figure who shaped the discipline of film studies among English speakers. When his career took off, the main issue he sought to address was to show that films can be seen in the same way as classical literature. Paralleling his roundabout at the time approach to film, he considered himself an outsider in the academy and had become tired of the orthodox ideas dominating British film criticism. Eventually, he would get up and move home base to Canada, where he would produce a great volume of works, one of which we're going to use today. What we're going to deal with are his writings on the horror genre. So Wood and Stassac, who I introduced before, have the same basic ideas about the other, except Wood continues and applies it in a strictly American context. So Wood's other uses criticisms of capitalism and ideas on sexual repression to portray what the dominant ideology of American society cannot accept. He accesses deep-seated fears to give each scene a feeling that can only be done away with once that other is assimilated or destroyed. It's fair to say we all may have dealt with perceptions of otherness in one way or another, though a surefire way to encounter the dynamic in action is to flip through a history book, stop every couple pages, and put your finger down on a random paragraph. It might take a few tries, but I guarantee it'll happen. Thanks to this podcast, however, you can leave your history books on the shelf, and we'll do the digging for you. So, the most blatant applications of the other we'll be looking at today, McHugh, come from antiquity, which is good because you said you liked ancient Greece.
Love that antiquity.
So, the Mediterranean realm, it was a host to a wide variety of peoples, right?
Yeah, so many different cultures. You got Rome and Greece sort of on the northern shore. You have the Iberian, this is even another example of that sort of otherness. You got what the Greeks and Romans qualified as barbarians in Gaul on the southern coast of France and in Iberia. And even with the Berbers in northern Africa, and then you got Egypt, which was this shining jewel of civilization on the Nile, and even the Phoenician culture on the eastern shore. So it was a host to so many different cultures.
So with all these different cultures, when a group came to power, they kind of had to reason why it was them who should stay on top, right? So many modern scholars look back to works from the classical age of ancient Greece, we'll say between 480 and 323 BCE, with great admiration. However, these same people have often failed to examine in much depth the meaning behind how these ancient authors describe other peoples. Greek authors generally classified distant peoples as barbarians, like you said, untamable savages, beasts by nature, the whole nine yards. Actual ethnic identity played a very small part here. These were simply the people furthest from the heart of so-called civilization. The Greeks used weather, geographic location, and just about anything that could distinguish the people and cultures from their own.
Well, that practically begs you to question their intent. Like, why did there have to be such a polarized distinction in the form of another? And how much did this feed into their perceived superiority?
That's good, and Aristotle seems to address these questions in Politics, though he leaves the answer pretty ambiguous. The passage from his text, often interpreted to support the case for perceived Greek superiority, comes from Euripides' play Iphigenia and Aulis. It's a satire in the form of a tragedy, critiquing this dynamic between Greeks and barbarians. Is it actually just? What is poetic about his reference to the words of a poet? Might Aristotle be suggesting something different? So that's the first case we'll look at, and after that, we'll expand our approach to deal with the more recent past. Stepping back for a moment, Wood's definition of the other was built to serve the horror film, but it's also extremely applicable in the Western genre. So give me a quick answer here, McHugh. What do you think American culture conditions you to love more than anything?
Well, that's kind of a fairly easy question. As I was growing up, I distinctly remember like being around my grandmother, and she would always tell you to like be proud of your country and where you come from. So America, like,
Okay.
it emphasizes this really like extreme nationalism and pride in where you come from, to the point of almost being excessive.
Okay. I like that you went there with that. So you're saying pride is kind of the biggest, like,
Yeah.
pride in oneself is the biggest American thing.
Yeah, and you could even go so far as to say that like it's one of the deadly sins that will eventually cause America's downfall. Like this pride is definitely one of the sins that are qualified as deadly in Christian sort of mythos.
Theology.
Yeah.
I like that. I'd say something similar. I'd say being the hero. That kind of goes hand in hand with pride, right?
Yeah,
like
a little bit.
At least a little bit. And so where is that a guarantee? In a push to capture the final frontier for your own people, slaughtering those who get in your way.
Yeah.
So it's an outplayed trope at this point, but I'm hinting towards the violent interactions in the frontier we see in movies between cowboys and Indians. So our case study for the American other comes with several benefits that the previous doesn't. First, it deals with American media, making it easier for people like you and me to connect to at a deeper level. And second, it exists in a much more recent past, which grants us a lot more sources to work with. As we examine the portrayal of indigenous peoples in Hollywood, we'll pull themes from two Western films that attempt to flip the idea of the savage native on its head to reflect on the savagery embedded in our own society. So this is where I'm going to get a little, I'm going to reach out to you a little bit. Regardless of case-specific takeaways, I hope you come out of this with at least one new insight on how cultures perceive one another through the trope of the other. I don't care if you think Greeks had a superiority complex. I don't care if you think Westerns are valuable representations of the frontier. I do care that you engage with why people might have thought some of these things.
Right.
America's become kind of a hodgepodge of different cultures, religions, and scholarship.
Yeah.
It's one
the
of
biggest
few
melting pot in the world.
Exactly. Like, it's one of few countries where nationality is kind of based in the diversity of its citizens. So people from all over the world have come to live in America, and we need to understand how to interact with one another's personal cultures. We need to have the ability to see what's respectful and what's problematic. Following that, we should be able to see how the other can influence the dominant narrative of our own nation. Understanding how it's used, we then have the power to rise above the us-them mindset it breeds. And to make this leap, we have to see things from a bird's eye view, to think about why we see them that way and for what purpose.
Right.
Awesome. So let's move on to our first case. We'll go to ancient Greece and we'll start with Aristotle. You got a little something for us on him?
Absolutely. So the Encyclopedia Britannica says that Aristotle was an ancient Greek philosopher. He was one of the most prolific philosophers of ancient Greece, alongside some of his other contemporaries.
Socrates, Plato,
Diogenes.
We could go on for ages naming old Greek dudes that everybody loves.
Yeah, Greeks were like big on philosophy. They loved that, ate it up. But Aristotle was born around 384 and died in 322 BCE. His ideas had a huge influence on the Renaissance and other intellectual revolutions following the Middle Ages, and that would cement him in the West view of scholarship. The encyclopedia even goes so far as to label him, and I quote, one of the greatest intellectual figures of Western history. it's fair considering the amount he's been studied, but it's scary when you look at some of the content of his works.
Yeah, they get a little graphic, but let's take a look at politics then. This first one I mentioned. So I worked with the Rackham translation, and I got that through the Perseus Project, which is a thing from Tufts University to make ancient texts more available online. And it's a little outdated, but it still has the correct general ideas. It's from 1944.
Right.
And so we'll be looking specifically at Book 1, which develops a theory of natural slavery that draws direct attention to the Greek barbarian dynamic. So let's take a listen to the passage I mentioned in the introduction. So this is a passage that references the Iphigenia in Aulis. And I already told you generally what the Iphigenia is, but to be a little more specific, it tells the story of the Greek armies at Aulis just before the Trojan War. And the armies can't seem to catch the wind on their ships, and thus they're forced by the gods, I believe it's Athena, to sacrifice King Agamemnon's daughter, Iphigenia, before setting sail. And so, examining the depictions of barbarism in this story, you can kind of reveal a larger social commentary that relates to philosophies of otherness and antiquity. And just one more little tidbit of information: the barbarians referred to in this play are the Trojans. So, because this is just prior to the Trojan War.
Yeah, and like you gotta love Mycenaean culture. It's like it's such a mystery, but it's also like so well documented by Homer and his epics and such. And it's just such a great way to study like how the Greeks viewed pretty much anyone that wasn't them. You know?
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about, and we'll get deeper into it in a minute.
Yeah.
But so let me read to you the passage from Politics, and then I can read you the original passage that he's referencing from the play.
Yeah.
So here is Politics. Yet among barbarians, the female and the slave have the same rank, and the cause of this is that barbarians have no class of natural rulers, but with them the conjugal partnership is a partnership of female slave and male slave. Hence the saying of the poets, "'Tis meet that Greeks should rule barbarians," implying that barbarian and slave are the same in nature. So you can see how kind of people might sway this to support a case for Greek superiority. But let me read the original passage from this play, and we'll see what you think about it. So this passage comes right after Iphigenia decides to actually allow them to sacrifice her body. She's given up. She thinks she's doing it for Greece, and she's letting them essentially kill her on an altar and sail away to fight a war. So let's hear it now. I give my body to Hellas, sacrifice it, and make an utter end of Troy. This is my enduring moment. Marriage, motherhood, and fame, all these is it to me. And it is right, mother, that Hellenes should rule barbarians, but not barbarians Hellenes, those being slaves while these are free. So you can kind of see how it works. And on the page I gave you, you see that I highlighted a couple sections that line up.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of interesting because Aristotle might have got caught by our academic honesty policies here a little bit. Part of it that mirrors the original passage is outside of the quotes. So he's using the implications that they say directly in here, and it's kind of interesting to think about.
Yeah.
Any initial thoughts on this?
Yeah, so one thing that I was kind of thinking about, in Iphigenia and Aulis, it kind of states that Iphigenia was sort of asked to be sacrificed by one of the gods, right? But I'm going to sort of jump to a different part of the world at this time. Like, Troy is somewhere in, like, the Turkish Balkan region, right? But in, like, the Gallic tribes of, like, what is now France and, like, the British Isles, Northumbria, that kind of area, you would also see people being sacrificed for their gods. And it's just strange to me that the Greeks thought, you know, our sacrifices are okay when demanded by our gods, but outside sacrifices demanded by outside gods that aren't ours are barbaric and wrong.
Okay.
And I think that they would use that as kind of like a distinction to sort of boost that superiority complex we've been talking about a little bit.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
I think I'm following. Let's move back towards Aristotle for now. And so I did a little more research on this reference here, and I used the article by Kevin Sherry posted in I believe it was the History of Political Thought, and it's titled "Does Aristotle Believe Greeks Should Rule Barbarians?"
Right. So it's like a direct sort of line to what we're talking about.
It's a direct line to this reference right here. And I think he puts it in an interesting way, and we'll see some connections down the line. So he kind of phrases this as an attempt to recharacterize Aristotle's theory of natural slavery to show sort of as like a reflection. So let's first look at the communities and relationships that he addresses in Aristotle's Book 1. So, essentially, since he holds barbarians to lack the natural capacity to rule, and Greeks do not, Aristotle says that Greeks have the master versus slave relationship and the male versus female. However, that leaves only the male slave versus female slave relationship for barbarians, right?
Right.
So, because of that, they are only kind of valuable to their masters for what they do. And so, if we turn back to the Iphigenia and Aulis, we see that in action, but among the Greeks, right?
Right.
Because these Greeks are kind of acting barbaric in a way. And they, when Clytemnestra, who is Agamemnon's wife, and Iphigenia come to the camp, they come under the guise that Iphigenia will be marrying Achilles, right?
Mm.
And so when they get there and eventually start to find out why they're really there and why Clytemnestra hasn't been told much about why they're there, they start to realize like how their own Greek people are being barbaric.
Right.
So at one point, Clytemnestra even suggests to Agamemnon that since he killed her first husband and conquered her, he is no different than Paris, the Trojan they're fighting, to get back his brother's wife.
Right.
And so, even first, Iphigenia urges Agamemnon to reject the pressure to sacrifice her, but he claims he has to do it, that all Greece is driving him to do it. And so his nature, as a citizen of Greece, drives him to treat his daughter as an object, something only useful for the purpose she fulfills, right?
Agamemnon should take like a dare course or something. This man needs to...
Oof. Oh, like, you're following my logic, though,
pressure.
Here, right?
Absolutely.
Clearly, the characteristics of the barbarians are assigned to the Greeks in this play. And so, in referencing this in politics, saying that it's fit that Greeks should rule barbarians, is it actually what Aristotle is saying? If he's referencing something critiquing Greek barbarism?
That's an excellent question.
And so... essentially, it does that, and it's just kind of ironic, is what Sherry is saying about Aristotle's use of the quote. That Iphigenia distinguishes the Greeks from the barbarians, and that the Greeks are free, is just kind of absurd, because they're all claiming they're bound to sacrifice her, that they are not free.
Right.
And so there's no objection to it, it's only an objection to who must be sacrificed.
So the master-slave relationship here is really, you could argue, between the Greek gods and the people of the earth.
I hadn't thought about it like that. I like how you said that right there. It keeps the dynamic Aristotle builds, if we want to take that for a legitimate dynamic, but then it moves it up a step.
Yeah, it's really like it's really like comparing the squabbling of man on earth to sort of the mastery of the gods over men.
I like that. We won't adhere to that too strictly, because that implies there's a hierarchy, and that can get iffy if we're saying it's barbarian Greek. I know what you're saying. It's just I'm thinking of all angles here now. So
please do.
There we are.
History is so multifaceted.
But so to summarize again, essentially, Euripides presents an intentionally unconvincing argument to call into question the notions that Greeks are superior to barbarians.
Right.
And so Aristotle uses that. He asserts that Greeks should rule barbarians. It's pretty blatant in its wording, but there's value to understanding it in this dramatic context. Greeks shouldn't necessarily rule barbarians, but should be careful they don't become them. That pride shouldn't come from ethnic difference or superiority. Instead, it should come naturally from the maintenance of communities that exist to better themselves. So what he's doing in this sense is using the image of the barbarians, with respect to Euripides' Greeks, to reflect back on the state of his society. This is a good spot to transition towards the bigger picture.
If you wouldn't mind if I interject there.
Okay, yeah. Any last thoughts here?
I did hear you use the word pride there, and that's even a callback to the way that Americans see ourselves now, with the sense of overwhelming pride that we feel. It's almost like, you know how history repeats itself, or it doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. It's almost like a rhyming of Americans with Greeks.
I like that.
In the poetry that is mankind's history.
So I'll just say for now, we got a little bit more Greece to get through, but we will definitely get to America in a minute. We'll be there soon.
Oh yeah.
So
just a little callback there.
Let's see. Call back, call forward. Even this podcast is rhyming with itself.
Yeah. Absolutely. Podcast is a microcosm of the American story and the world story, really.
Yeah. So let's see. Basically, the use of a barbarian people in comparison to the Greeks is essential to this work, but it's also central to many other ancient authors' writings. So Francois Hartog is a pretty big name in the study of antiquity, definitely of Greece. So I'm going to gamble. Have you heard of Herodotus?
Oh, Herodotus is the father of your major, man. Herodotus is the first historian from Greece.
Awesome. I'm glad you like Herodotus. Now,
Absolutely.
I know you're an Assassin's Creed fan as well. Give me the...
Guilty.
I also know he is in Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Could I get maybe a quick rundown of, like, his role in Assassin's Creed Odyssey?
Yeah, so sort of what happens in the game is you play as a mercenary, a Misthios, from the island of Kefalonia. And when you first leave to go in pursuit of your father, you arrive in Phokis, which is where the Oracle lives, like the Oracle of Delphi, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And so what you do while in Delphi is you meet Herodotus, and he decides to come along with you and document your trips as part of his histories.
Okay.
And so he's sort of a traveling companion that stands on your ship with you and like follows you around documenting your story.
Okay. I actually like that a lot because I haven't played the game, but I have read the histories. So basically what you're saying is they're trying to write him in to, or I guess, write the assassin's story into Herodotus's histories.
Maybe, like, I haven't read the histories. I should,
we're kind of on, we're on opposite sides of the table here. But
figuratively and literally.
Yeah.
But I haven't read the histories, so I can't say whether or not they're emulating that with the story. But I do know for sure that you go all around Greece and all through the different regions, to Sparta, to Athens, to Boeotia, to the different islands of the Aegean.
Okay.
So you are kind of roughly going around the Greek world like Herodotus did.
Okay. And I'd assume there's some sort of Persian War involvement with the game then, if it's that time.
So the time period actually takes place after the Persian War. So you play as a descendant of Leonidas. And so it takes place during like the war between the Delian League and what was the Spartan alliance?
We can just call them the Spartans for now.
Yeah, so it's a war between the Delian League and like the Spartan army.
Class.
Yeah.
But
so it's more the Peloponnesian War. That's the word I'm looking for.
Boom. Exactly.
So, you play as a mercenary in the Peloponnesian War, and Herodotus follows you around documenting it.
Okay. So, combining Herodotus and Thucydides a little bit there, but I like that. So we'll move on for now. That was a little bit of a digression, but I'm glad we got to kind of figure out who Herodotus was pop culture wise there.
Oh yeah.
So, anyways, Francois Hartog, the dude I mentioned just before that, he wrote a book called The Mirror of Herodotus: The Representation of the Other in the Writing of History, where he credits exactly. And so he credits the ancient author with using all sorts of techniques to convey images of distant groups. The general idea is that these people were in no way a single barbarian group, but that Herodotus joined them together for ease of readability and to be able to reflect on his own society. He wasn't writing for us, not for 21st century scholars or modern college students, or for most people down the line. The Histories was part history, part travel literature, and part primitive ethnology, appealing to his contemporaries. And these contemporaries worked with what they saw at home, so he had to describe faraway people and places in such terms. This is where the mirror comes into play. Take monsters, for example. All the elements of the monsters he describes need to be familiar so that a Greek reader feels that sense of monstrosity. Herodotus, like Aristotle, is connecting the bridges between the two, albeit for slightly different purposes, but you get the gist of it. That's why we're here discussing it.
Right.
So, before we move on and, talk about Herodotus's use of the other, I want to ask you a question. This one might be a difficult one. Now,
no difficult questions, only difficult answers.
Imagine I'm not me. Imagine I am someone from Arkansas who has never left the state, never even left the town, just been on, say, a farmhouse my whole life. How do you tell me what the beach looks like? Well, I don't have internet either. I've never seen a beach in my life.
Awesome. So, just standard, like, farmhouse man from Arkansas, right?
Okay, yeah.
Well, I'd first ask you, have you seen a creek or a river?
Okay.
And should you have seen a creek or a river, I'd say, think about that, but the shore on the other side of the river doesn't end. And it's like an analogy in that way. But if you haven't, I'd ask you, like the tub that your sort of farm animals drink out of.
Okay.
It's like that, but it's infinite and salty.
And salty.
And salty. You have to remember the salt because, 70% of the world is the ocean, or roughly. And a lot of that ocean is salt water. Yeah.
Awesome. That was actually better than all the answers I was thinking of when I was thinking about this question. Like, I hadn't put too much thought into it, but very good.
Thank you.
So,
glad to
that happens. But then, so Herodotus essentially was working with, like, everything that he could just find, everything he could stumble upon, essentially, when he was traveling.
Right.
The problem then becomes knowing what is fact and what is speculation, what is seen and what is heard. This is something to consider with all authors, ancient and modern, though he typically tells the reader before diving into hearsay. But this can still make reading it a little more difficult, because in his digressions on certain people or places, you can tell he's starting to describe things by how his tense shifts. Acknowledged or not, though, the shift makes it near impossible to tell where any details actually come from. And this jump between a narrative voice and a commenting voice happens a lot. So the other complication is that placing things in terms of a Greek standard and an other makes it extremely difficult to leave a middle ground. An example Hartog gives of this could be Herodotus' description of the Scythians and Amazons. So I'm sure you've probably heard of the Amazons in the context of Wonder Woman today.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And it's not too different, right? Like, they're an ancient race of warrior women, protectors of their people.
I am also very familiar with the famed I believe she was an Amazon, Atalanta, the fastest woman alive. She was like a mythological figure, but I remember like many men tried to race her for her hand in marriage, and none succeeded because she was just extremely fast.
Yeah.
It was almost like a Greek testament to like the power that women could have, But
yeah,
like it might not be that deep. It might have just been a story about
like essentially like I get what you're saying. Basically, like in simpler terms, their gender norms in marriage and war are just completely opposite those of ancient Greek tradition.
Yeah.
Like in myth, in assuming they were real and whatever, they were just said to be essentially taking on the role of ancient Greek men, but like times 2, times 3. They were super strong, super powerful,
taller
super
than
fast.
a Greek man.
Yeah. And so the Scythians now, on the other hand, they refer to a number of peoples. So generally, they would refer to several semi-nomadic groups near modern-day Turkey and the Black Sea, and they're kind of joined together for narrative purposes in Herodotus' thing. It's a very general term he uses. And so when these two groups meet, the Amazons and the Scythians, they were said to marry and bear children who would become known as the Sauromatai. And so the marriage of the two groups is what Herodotus must make sense of for his reader through the mirror we've established. When the groups meet, he makes sense of it by posing the Scythians as quasi-Greek. So for a Greek audience to understand the two groups, two peoples already radically different to themselves, he attaches the familiar aspects to the more familiar group. Because the Amazons present a more fundamental difference to the Greek perception of gender roles, they act as the other party. When he describes that in the Greek tradition it is the woman who brings her family's dowry, he's presenting the mirror. To maintain this Greek baseline, it is the Scythian men who must be said to collect the dowry. Instead of describing in detail intricate Scythian marriage customs and explaining how they'd have merged with those of the Amazons, he draws upon the common knowledge of his readership, the Greek mirror. Even in removing the Greeks from the picture, he finds a way to reflect back on aspects of his own culture to keep the reader engaged in what might realistically have become confusing.
Yeah, that's very... I don't know if he does this, but, like, it would be very cool if he did that for sort of most of the extraneous non-Greek groups that he encountered. Like, you could argue that any sort of people east of the Danube or, like, in, like, Gaul or in the Rhine or anything, were barbarians to the Greeks. And it's just, like, if he were to do that for all of those people that he encountered, that would be, like, mind-blowing as a, like, very progressive for an ancient Greek, rather, is what I'm looking for.
Yeah. I mean, like, it's at least, I'd say, a little, I don't know if I'd quite say progressive, but I'd say it's at least a little more progressive that he uses Scythian. It's still a generalization that, like, kind of ignores, like, intricate parts of the culture, and he's really kind of using his own culture to show them.
Right.
But, like, I don't know if you know the linguistic origin for the word barbarians.
Yeah, it's because barbarians would go bar.
Yeah. So,
or it would sound like that to the Greeks.
Yeah. So I don't know quite how that all fits in with this exactly, but I think you get the idea. That
I think I do a little bit.
To show a different people,
Yeah.
it's easiest to explain it in terms that make sense with respect to your own people.
That's actually a perfect segue into something else I was hoping to talk about, if you don't mind.
Okay, give me a quick.
So in, like, very, very brief, in, like, Greek myths, like, you'll see a lot of, like, monsters and barbarians with that hero figure you described. Like, some that come to mind are the myth of Perseus and the Medusa, or Orpheus in the underworld, right? Who, like, is then, like, destroyed, like, emotionally when his wife Eurydice is torn away from him forever, a second time. And it's just, like, calling back to that hero complex you mentioned earlier, like, the Greek myth is kind of like an allegory for the hero versus the other, like the standard Greek hero's journey. Because you'll see, like, Perseus and Orpheus fighting these great odds that are completely alien to them. Like, they have some cultural idea, but they don't really know. Much like the Greeks kind of have some idea of what people outside are, but they don't really have any knowledge of the specifics, right?
Yeah.
So it's just cool that, like, even in their myths and the stories they passed down, they had this other versus the hero relationship.
Yeah. It's a very common trope, and that's why I wanted to center this podcast on it.
Yeah.
So,
like, the more we talk about it, the more I see it.
Yeah. And so let's talk about it more, but let's jump around a little. We're going to move on to our second case study now. We're going to move on to Native Americans in pop culture now. And so it feels safe to assume that anyone listening to this would have heard of the Western movie genre.
Oh, absolutely.
Cowboys, Indians, the whole 9 yards. And so everything that goes into creating that theatric atmosphere of the Western frontier is meant to make the audience forget they're looking at a screen. Movies, screenwriters, in genres especially like this one, they want to show you something real. But the problem comes when they try to use people or cultures they're unfamiliar with to tell their story. And this happens a lot here with Native Americans. So Virginia McLaurin, a Native American media scholar who actually went to Umass like us, she analyzed around 60 films, TV shows, and books spanning the 90s to the 2000s and saw a massive amount of stereotyping in them.
Wow. Not surprising, but wow.
Yeah. And so, granted, the media she looked at depicted modern settings, but the point is that even in a modern setting, creators put little work into seeing indigenous peoples in a better light. So they preferred the stereotypes because they fit with the purposes they had in mind. And this really puts a strict perspective on who can be a real indigenous person, quote-unquote real indigenous person. They're depicted as extremely removed from American culture. They appear traditional, spiritual, brave, to name a few things. McLaurin even notes that this can become comical in a way sometimes. Like, she references an episode of Criminal Minds where a Native American police officer can tell which FBI agent is concealing a gun by the weight of his footsteps. Like,
wow.
Like, what's that even mean? Like,
I mean, like, I guess she's trying to say that like this man was clunking around, so it felt like he had some extra weight on him, but like it's still such a like an extraneous thing that like, you wouldn't expect.
It's really drawing on just the tropes of spiritualism and like being like strong warriors and attuned to nature that like it's kind of absurd. Like, why is it necessary here other than to distinguish that this dude is Native American in comparison to his co-workers?
Yeah,
I think
he was probably raised in the same environment as his co-workers.
Yeah. Although I can't speak too much more on that specific example just because the episode is also called The Tribe, I believe. And so, and I haven't watched it. I'm not the biggest Criminal Minds guy.
Yeah, I've never seen it.
But yeah. So then if we move back to old Hollywood, the image we get of natives is even more specific, right? They essentially had a de facto dress code for different people that was meant to evoke certain meanings or distinctions. A one-off outfit didn't mean much. More so, this meant that general costuming was supposed to reflect a character's culture, personality, or even a little bit of both. So what this meant for films involving indigenous peoples was that they were typically reduced to a combination of braids, beads, and buckskin. So I use those terms just to kind of generalize even more, but essentially both sexes would be pictured with long hair. You could find an assortment of leather clothing combined with beaded and feathered accessories. There was a lot of face and body paints. It was a detailed image, but it was often extremely insensitive to the differences between tribal cultures.
Yeah.
Like, for example, this is another kind of modern example, but Peter Pan.
Yeah.
It used teepees and totem poles, which never would have seen each other, really.
No.
Like, totem poles are Pacific Northwest, teepees are Great Plains.
Yeah, totem poles are like an animist sort of culture. Teepees are just a form of housing that would be used on, like, an internomadic culture on the plains.
Yeah, like, essentially just, they combined aspects from all across America.
And they just stereotyped the more blatant things that people would remember, because it was to sell a movie.
The most vivid images, And so, in depicting them singularly as people who kind of had just this one cohesive culture, it got kind of bad. And also within this framework, another important thing to think about is that Western film directors frequently defaulted to the idea of the savage Indian. And so this was like, they would be depicted as people who only wanted to hunt, to kill, to be better than their enemies, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And
sorry, please continue.
Oh, I was just going to say that, like, that easily gives a cowboy, like, a natural antagonist to fight against if they default to that.
I was going to say, like, that's even present, like, that sort of trope, they're not quite Native Americans at all, but that trope's present in a lot of literature as well, is what I'm saying. Because, like, even in, like, I believe it was William Gould's Lord of the Flies, you'll see that, like, the children on that island adopt a lot of those tropes, and, like, they paint themselves with, like, pigments, and they do all these, like, Native American things. They only want to hunt and kill these pigs on the island.
Exactly.
So it's just a very present trope.
Yeah, like the whole idea of just using a generalized image to represent a specific kind of train of thought or school of thought.
Exactly.
Or culture or whatever it may be. And so in Western movies, where this gets interesting for us is with the revisionist Western movement in the period of time following the Vietnam War. So I feel like it's become common knowledge by now that the Vietnam War was primarily like a brutal proxy war, and it's really like a blemish on our country's reputation.
Oh yeah.
It seemed to fit the ideological conflict of the time, but it was completely wrong, should not have happened, essentially. Yes. Most people can acknowledge that now. Surrounded on all sides by countercultural opinion, two films found an allegory for war and genocide in the historical conflicts between the United States military and the Southern Cheyenne. So this brings us to the two films we watched together, Soldier Blue and Little Big Man.
Yes.
And so these draw upon the stories of the Sand Creek and Washita River massacres, two of the bloodiest, most violent slaughters of Native Americans committed by the U.S. military. Some minute differences from the historical events and directorial intentions aside for the moment, the two films take a play from Herodotus' book and use the Cheyenne to reflect back on the United States. The natives were not simply savage barbarians, but the mirror in which we are to see our own savage reflection. Now, let's take a look at the films, the events they portray, what they symbolize, and why did they choose the image of the Native American.
Right.
So, let's start with Soldier Blue, right?
Yeah,
So,
Soldier Blue.
To generalize the story, a cavalry group is attacked by the Cheyenne. There are only 2 survivors, Honus and Cresta, and together they attempt to reach the cavalry's base camp, right?
Yeah.
Along the way, Honus becomes torn between his love for Cresta and her anti-American beliefs. Cresta having once been the wife of the chief that attacked that cavalry unit, right?
Though I believe she was forced to be his wife, she definitely did sympathize with the Cheyenne.
Okay. Yeah. I wasn't quite sure how she became his wife in the first place, but she certainly sympathized with the Cheyenne for what she'd seen.
Oh, absolutely.
And what we are yet to see in the film.
It's funny that they talk about her beliefs as anti-American as well. It's just such so strange to me that anti-American is like a bad thing in a country where freedom of speech is touted so highly.
Yeah, it was kind of odd. So I got that from the IMDb summary. And this movie was still made in the 70s. And so it's kind of like... I feel like they're trying to build it up to be like Honus is the unaware observer, right?
Yeah.
He's unaware of like what's actually going on out there. He has like kind of these American ideas. He himself was once part of the U.S. military.
Yeah.
And then once we get to the end, which we'll talk about in a moment, he realizes how wrong he'd been, and oh, how wrong he was. Oh, how wrong he was. Wrong. So, I mentioned that these were some of the kind of bloodiest and worst massacres by the U.S. military in our country's history, and they really wanted to show that in the film. And so, the massacre at the end of the film was about 6.5 minutes long, and the crew brought in amputees, children and adults, and had a van filled with prosthetic limbs, fake heads, and other animatronics to make it that much more brutal.
Wow.
And so...
I didn't know about all those effects.
Yeah, there was a lot that went into that scene, if you remember when we were watching it.
It was brutal.
And so, this isn't how you really expect, like, a traditional, or I'll say older, not necessarily traditional, Western film to go. Like, usually they kind of follow that white savior sort of cowboy storyline. But this was a revisionist Western. And two critics, actually, Steve Mitchell and Howard S. Berger, actually characterized Soldier Blue as an anti-Western, unintended for most people who love the action of traditional Westerns.
Almost like a counterculture Western movie.
Yeah, exactly. And so we'll reflect on that now, I suppose. So I mentioned the context of the Vietnam War, right?
Right.
And so this large massacre at the end actually attempted to reflect on the U.S. military's atrocities in the My Lai massacre that happened over in Vietnam.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
So the battle scene actually attempts to recreate several iconic photos that were taken at the real massacre and then published later in Life magazine. So if that's not a mirror, I don't know what is, because
for real. Like, that's a blatant mirror. It was directly made to mirror that massacre.
Yeah. And I couldn't quite find the photos of the massacre, and it would be brutal to look at them.
Yeah, I don't know if we should be showing that on a podcast anyway.
Yeah, but essentially they're kind of reflecting back on this. They're drawing parallels between the genocide of Native Americans and the genocide of innocent Vietnamese citizens.
Yeah.
And so that's a powerful message they're sending there.
And it's kind of it's even more of a strong mirror, I would say, because they're both like natives to that land that's being trampled on over something that the white conqueror is seeing as important.
And so to hammer this in even more, I was looking at the promotional material, right? The posters that were on the IMDb website, and a straight quote from the movie poster is a movie whose time is now. So it's literally like, even if it's not like directly saying like this is showing you what it's like in Vietnam right now. Yeah. It's literally saying like this still happens. Like,
hey,
it's something that hasn't gone away, and that like probably won't go away if we don't stand here and think about it for a sec, why it's wrong. And so that happens. But
it was such a brutal scene at the end too.
It was just painful to watch at points.
Yes, no, I remember like watching it and like the thoughts going through my head were like, why? Like this is so like I've never seen anything this graphic or gruesome before.
Yeah,
I've seen a lot of graphic and gruesome stuff, but like this topped it all. Mm-hmm. It was.
I'm sorry, I know I kind of threw you into there last minute. You came down from doing some homework. It was like already 1 a.m. and then we just went right for it, kind of.
No, a little Hail Mary action, but you know it was like kind of eye opening. So I'm grateful for the experience. You know, as gruesome as it was, like it's the kind of stuff you have to see and think about.
The debates kind of between Honus and Cresta the whole time, talking about who is the more brutal, and then just kind of in the end seeing that we're both brutal, but
it's a dialogue on that the whole way through.
Yeah, we're both brutal, but like. We shouldn't be trying to be the more brutal group. It's messed up. And so
it's about both parties taking a step back and realizing that this is not important.
Yeah.
And that peace can be found.
I have one more note I wanted to address on Soldier Blue, and then we can move on quickly to Little Big Man. So Soldier Blue, one thing with the director of the film is that in reading about him and the production of the film, it said he was not very politically motivated in making this, which honestly is a little unnerving. Like certainly he wanted to say that like in saying a movie whose time is now, you're certainly hinting to that like things like this still happen, and it's messed up. But like he used the natives and like the historical slaughter of them. But he used it as a medium. He wasn't quite thinking about what it meant for them. Like like the person-to-person depictions of the natives were still kind of like just like plainly brutal and like plainly fighting until the moment where they like surrendered at the end. Yeah. Seeing like what was to come, but there really wasn't like any like low like person-to-person commentary on actual native culture, so it was still a little problematic.
Oh, absolutely! Like it was taking a step in the right direction, but it didn't quite hit the destination.
It was reflecting on ourselves much more than it was supposed to be reflecting on them.
Yeah, it wasn't about like accurately depicting native culture. Yeah, it was about accurately depicting like American violence.
Yeah, exactly. And so let's move on to Little Big Man then. So Little Big Man is a different massacre of Native Americans. It's the Washita River Massacre.
I believe, like, if I recall correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it actually also references one of the other, or rather, not a massacre of Native Americans, but at the end it does talk about sort of the massacre, or like the Battle of the Little Big Horn.
It does, yes.
Which is sort of like a reflection of that massacre, because it's the natives attacking the Americans, right? And winning. Yeah. Which was unheard of.
Yeah. And so this is, I think when we were actually watching the film, you mentioned the Battle of Little Big Horn can also be called Custer's Last Stand. Yes. Because that's where he dies. And so this movie actually has General Custer in it. And in the first massacre, the Washita River Massacre, Custer and his 7th Cavalry attacked 250 Southern Cheyenne at the Washita River, which is in modern-day Oklahoma. And Custer was even said to have taken Little Rock's 18-year-old daughter, Monaceda, as his mistress. And so then he gave the rest of the women to his men to be raped. So it was really like a brutal, brutal thing that they were using here.
It's like embarrassing for the U.S. because like Oklahoma was land given to the natives by, I believe it was Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was not a good man, but that's like the one thing that, like, he slaughtered Native Americans. The one thing that can be said for him is that he gave them land. And so, like, after this trail of tears, this migration to Oklahoma, it's embarrassing that the U.S. massacred them anyway.
Yeah. And so, I believe it mentioned in my research that Custer's division, the 7th Cavalry, was even founded explicitly to kill Native Americans. So, like, he literally did that to just hunt in the Oklahoma territory. So really, like,
that's a parallel, actually. That's another parallel to like the natives who like, or the native depiction rather,
Okay.
because like they're depicted as people who just want to hunt and kill, right? But it's
Yeah.
really Custer's cavalry that was founded to hunt and kill and to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Reflections. Reflecting back.
Herodotus was onto something.
And so, Little Big Man does a lot more with the moving back to that.
Yeah.
It does kind of a lot with the countercultural aspect of it that Soldier Blue even doesn't really do. That kind of, because Soldier Blue connects to the actual massacre, the My Lai massacre, but Little Big Man attempts to reverse the traditional perspective of Native Americans in Western films by kind of breaking them out of the mold of the noble savage or the just the savage in general. And so they're kind of sympathetic figures, and they radiate normality as opposed to sort of exoticism. They're still costumed kind of in a native fashion, but it's a little more accurate, and how they interact with the protagonist, Jack Crabbe, is a lot different. So, like, I'm sure you noticed there was I forget his name. It was Younger Bear.
Was that the effeminate, more cross-dressing one?
No,
Sorry,
but
I didn't mean
that's
to bring
another
that
one
up
in
too
there.
early.
That's another one in there. That's fine. We can talk about them real quick. Like how counterculture during Vietnam kind of emanated the message of accepting all and doing that. It kind of included like transgender people and the LGBTQ plus community. And what I was hinting at with Younger Bear was kind of the more direct connection to the counterculture. Because if you remember, at one point in the movie, he became a contrary who was said to do everything backwards, even speak, except in fighting. Fighting was the only place he didn't do something backwards.
So he was literally counterculture.
Yeah.
Right.
So he was supposed to be the literal representation of the counterculture.
Like the extreme version.
Mm-hmm. Like, it still makes me laugh thinking about how he washed himself with sand and dried himself off with water.
Yeah.
That was very funny. But
it's good that they took like a more humorous lens on this movie. It was like a breath of fresh air after the atrocities.
It still
of Soldier
uses
Blue.
the natives, but it portrays them not in an over kind of stereotyped way. It uses them just to be kind of, again, as the medium to tell this story of genocide, but in a way that doesn't kind of belittle them in any way.
Yeah.
It really makes them like empathetic and sympathetic characters that you can connect with.
Yeah.
And so,
like I think that the father figure to Jack, Old Lodgkins, the chief, was one of my favorite characters in the movie. Definitely.
yeah, he was an awesome character.
Yeah.
Let's see. I feel like we've touched most of the things there. Do you have any other thoughts on there that you might have wanted to throw in there before we start wrapping up?
Not particularly. I think we hit on everything. It was just like a really, like, I would recommend it to anyone listening right now. Like, it was just a really good movie.
Yeah, Little Big Man was good, and it still has, all movies have their caveats, but like I think it's an enjoyable movie that has a valuable representation of kind of this massacre that makes it more approachable by an American audience.
And a valuable message. I would say that, like,
message.
Ending on the Battle of the Little Bighorn and Custer's last stand kind of displays how the barbarism of people can be overcome with time and effort, you know?
Yeah.
Because they, like, the natives did overcome the barbarism of the U.S. Maybe not entirely, but they at least had that victory over Custer.
Yeah. It was more uplifting that it ended on a victory for the natives. And so I have one more quote I want you to respond to real quick for me before we finish up our discussion of the Native American portion of the podcast. So this comes from a film journal that I researched that talked about kind of Western films and how these were moving away from the traditional portrayals of Native Americans. And so the quote reads, "If Soldier Blue and to a lesser extent Little Big Man allowed contemporaneity to muddy their approaches to Sand Creek and Washita, They finished off the Western as a vehicle for institutionalized anti-Native American racism. So, would you agree with this? Would you agree that they kind of finished off the ability to use the Native American kind of culture and image as a racist thing in films?
I wouldn't say that they completely erased it, but I would say that they definitely lessened that. Because, whether or not something can be used for racist and malicious intent is really up to whoever's using it. Yeah. If somebody wants to use something to promote racism, they're gonna do that.
Yeah.
But, it's up to films like this to educate people and sort of make them realize, hey, this isn't the reality. There's more to, so many cultures than this.
Yeah. We really have to, in making things, you always really have to think about your message. And this is using Native Americans in a way that doesn't actively attempt to belittle them, to reflect on something worse that happened as a result of white Americans.
Yeah.
And so I think the movies do a good job, but obviously, definitely, there will still be people who have cruel ideas and racist ideas until the day the planet's gone.
The thing to remember, though, is that with movies like this and, with ideas like this circulating in humanity, that proportion is going to lessen and lessen and lessen every day.
Yeah. It's all about becoming more aware of it.
Absolutely.
And so let's conclude now. I feel like we've got a lot of good ideas out there. Let's move on to thinking about it in terms of a whole. So Aristotle, using Euripides, kind of gave us a cautionary tale, right?
Right.
He was trying to tell us to be careful about our actions, because if we aren't, we could become barbarians ourselves.
Right.
And then Herodotus kind of also uses this idea of kind of reflecting on our own actions, but in a different way, to use it kind of as a lens through which we're able to identify other people and concepts. We can use it in a way that links back directly to ourselves, in some cases.
And that's, again, visible in ancient Greek myth as well, and their depictions of monsters versus heroes, and how that sort of evolves through Western history.
Yeah. And so then Soldier Blue, Little Big Man, and Genocide, right? They're all kind of, both of them are commenting on this common aspect of brutal American military action, and kind of reflecting that through these Native American massacres. And so using clear-cut distinctions kind of seemed to be the default way to describe and understand people in antiquity. But now, as we're kind of seeing with these revisionist Western movies, is that groups who were once isolated from each other have been brought together in ways Herodotus never could have imagined. And we can see parallels all across them. And so as the world becomes a more diverse place, the distinct us versus them mindset of otherness hopefully will fade away. But we shouldn't disregard the ability of it, as in these movies and these texts, to reflect back on ourselves as a culture too, to see the us in them. It's extremely important that we recognize how it can present itself in societal discourse, to be able to control the effects of how we choose to see things. Aristotle certainly leaned into the power he had as a Greek scholar when he wrote the first book of Politics, but in referencing the Iphigenia, he adds a whole different layer to our analysis of his words, with an immense cultural significance for his audience, the Greeks. Amidst the Vietnam War, how were filmmakers to address countercultural discontent in a way that would reach as many people and be as intimately tied to America as possible? Through the mirror of the Native American, an other to the early colonists of our country, whose history reveals the barbarity in ourselves. The other can be used as a tool of hate, but it can also be used to tear down that same hate which has become so ingrained in our way of thinking. We'll never stop comparing ourselves to other people. It's human nature, but we can still work to do so consciously in a way that plants us all on equal footing. So I hope you learned something today, McHugh. I hope you took something away from that, and hopefully we'll get to thinking about ourselves and other people in good ways after this.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a great discussion. Had a great time.
Of course. Thank you for joining me again.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us, everybody.
People,
We'll see you next time.